Last time, when we left off, we were looking at men's preferences for long-term relationships, and we were starting to shift gears into examining what males and females value in shorter-term relationships. And obviously, long-term and short-term relationships carry different costs and benefits, and they carry them differentially for each sex. So you should expect some degree of sex differences in our psychological mechanisms for managing these problems. And as we also noted, studying the short-term mating behaviors can be tricky. And this is because there's a heavy degree of social consequence that can follow from mating in short-term contexts. These consequences can result from social judgments, sometimes fear of physical reprisal following some short-term sexual behavior. That is, if someone is having an affair, murder is not an unusual outcome were it to be discovered. And because of these consequences, it's really not always easy to get a good sense for people's behavior in this domain, because people want to conceal this information to avoid those consequences. Especially if they're in a relationship. You don't really want to tell people that you're having an affair when you're in a relationship, but also even to a lesser extent when they're single, because there are social and reputational costs that come along with this. So because discussing these topics openly and honestly can do damage to people's relationships and reputations, some people end up pretty reluctant to express their desires in the short-term realm. Nevertheless, there is physiological evidence in our bodies and the bodies of other species that short-term mating was at least a somewhat recurrent feature of our ancestral environments, though the extent of how much short-term behavior there was is a lot harder to measure. We do know it existed, we just don't know exactly how much there was. And we saw that there were some adaptations in males that appear to reflect the frequency of this short-term mating, inasmuch as if you look at relative testes size between species, how large are a male's testicles relative to the rest of their body, this can serve as a rough gauge to the frequency of sperm competition in that species. And as you may recall, sperm competition refers to contexts where sperm from multiple males, that is, more than one, are present inside the female reproductive tract at the same time, and they are competing with each other, literally or metaphorically, to fertilize the limited number of eggs that the female releases. Specifically, the more common sperm competition seems to be in a species, the larger the male testicle size tends to be relative to its overall body size. Now that's not a perfect measure of sperm competition, of course, but it does seem to show a general correlation. And this makes sense on the grounds that male gametes, sperm, and the seminal fluid that it's in, is metabolically costly to produce. And so we shouldn't expect that the male body is going to produce sex cells without limit, because energy invested in gamete production and the tissues that make them is energy not invested elsewhere in the body. So it should only be in cases where males can benefit by producing more sperm that additional resources, metabolic resources, should be invested in those bodily tissues. It should only prove adaptive to have large testicles if you need to produce more sperm than average. And of course, one such context where you want to produce more sperm is when you're attempting to produce not just enough to fertilize an egg, but rather to increase the odds that your sperm is the sperm that fertilizes the egg relative to the sperm of rivals that is present in the reproductive tract at the same time. So, using testicle to body size as an estimate, we can conclude that such contexts of sperm competition are likely more common in humans than they are in, say, gorillas, because gorillas have very small testicle size relative to their overall body. But it's less common in humans than it is in chimps. That is, chimps have very large testicles in comparison to the rest of their body. And of course, in gorillas, you tend to see mating systems where a single male has a relative monopoly over the mating opportunities of the females in the vicinity, whereas in chimps, when a female comes into estrus, she will mate, I don't want to say indiscriminately, but far less discriminately with lots of different males in the area. And so there is more competition, sperm competition, in the chimps than it is in the gorillas, simply owing to the amount of mating that takes place at or about the same time. And we also saw that the more time in humans, the more time a male spends away from his partner, the average number of sperm they ejaculate per copulation when they are reunited tends to increase during subsequent intercourse. So the more time a male spends away from his partner, the more sperm tends to be found in their ejaculates. And both of these findings seem to suggest that human females, and also human males by extension, have engaged in short-term mating with one or more partners at various times throughout evolutionary history. However, not all short-term sexual behavior involves sperm competition. That is, sometimes you just have people that have short-term sex with a single partner instead of many. And as such, we can appreciate that these adaptations for sperm competition may underestimate the degree of short-term mating behaviors that took place in humans' evolutionary history. Because you don't need adaptations for sperm competition if there's no other sperm to compete with. And that is the case when a woman may just have sex with a single male in a short-term capacity, rather than several in relatively rapid succession. So while it's still an open question as to how much short-term mating took place over human evolutionary history, the answer is at least some on a regular basis, and probably more. It was more frequent at some times than others, and in some locations than others, depending on whatever local, ecological, or social conditions existed. I don't think there was ever a stable amount of short-term mating. It depends on who's available and what are the benefits and what are the costs and what are the punishments. But in addition to these physiological adaptations, we also saw that there are psychological adaptations for short-term mating as well, such as those that are responsible for generating sexual preferences and fantasies. And these serve as a pretty good indicator as well that short-term mating was a recurrent feature of our species' evolutionary history. After all, if there was no short-term behavior, there would be no selection pressure for psychological mechanisms that appear to attend to it. That is, in the case of men, you see men and women have different short-term sexual fantasies. We're going to see a little bit more on that later today. Men will desire more sexual partners than women. Men will focus more on physical gratification in these fantasies. Women will focus more on emotional gratification. Men tend to imagine a variety of partners, whereas women tend to imagine more specific partners that they're familiar with. But we have these fantasies, and they do relate to these short-term mating strategies. And this is evidence that short-term mating was indeed part of our species' evolutionary history, for much the same reason that if we were to evolve in a world without sugar, we probably wouldn't have any mechanisms dedicated to tasting sugar. And there also, if we evolved in an environment without light, we wouldn't have any adaptations for detecting light. And it's interesting, actually, if you take species that live in underground caves, you find they don't have any eyes. They don't have the ability to process visual information because no visual information from light reaches them there. And eyes are metabolically costly to grow, develop, and maintain. And so when you see species travel from a world with light to a world without light, you observe over time that the eyes they used to have are lost in development. And interestingly, it can actually be the case sometimes that you see the eyes in these species develop initially, but then that development is halted, or it develops poorly, or the eye is sometimes even broken back down for metabolic resources later. And this is because without inputs being recurrently present in an environment, there's no pressure maintaining or selecting for the mechanisms that process that input. No light, no physiological mechanisms for processing light, no psychological mechanisms for processing light. Similarly, no short-term sexual behavior. You shouldn't see any physiological adaptations for short-term sexual behavior or psychological preferences for it because it simply wouldn't have been a feature. That these things exist suggests the presence of short-term mating. So, with that point in mind, that short-term behavior, whether involving one or multiple partners at approximately the same time, was a feature of human evolutionary history, we can start to consider more about what things each sex might be able to access through their short-term sexual behavior. That is, what are the benefits to short-term sex? Like all behaviors in life, there are costs and benefits associated with everything. And if short-term behavior was all costs, we wouldn't see people engaging it. And indeed, there are costs to short-term mating, as we did cover, including losses of existing relationships, violent reprisals, reputational damage. So there have to be some compensating benefits to the short-term behavior. And there's no reason to suspect they're necessarily distributed evenly between the sexes. So as we've seen before, the main rate limiter in terms of male reproduction in humans and many other species, for males, the greatest rate limiter tends to be the available number of females they can mate with. And it's clear from this knowledge what the primary benefit that men can gain from a short-term encounter is. That is, the opportunity to reproduce at an extremely reduced cost, at least relative to females. So as such, it should really come as no surprise that when men don't have to invest much of anything in a partner in order to obtain that mating opportunity, men's standards in a partner generally relax in short-term contexts relative to long-term ones. And this is because these short-term mating opportunities can represent huge fitness gains at relatively minor fitness costs. Whatever time and energy and risk you need to put in to obtain that mating behavior, you get the chance to reproduce entirely, which is huge. So, even if the prospective partner you're going to mate with in the short-term context isn't as attractive in a variety of ways that you might otherwise prefer, the opportunity for short-term mating may still prove to be attractive enough to take. It's the old saying, like how sex for men is a lot like pizza, which is that when it's good, it's great, and when it's not, it's still pretty good. So if we're going to put this into a simple numbers example, just to wrap our minds around it and to simplify the idea, if a man is a 10 out of 10 in terms of attractiveness, he might only accept partners that range from a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 if he was going for a long-term relationship. So that is, if he's going to forego many, if not all, other partners and settle down with one and invest in that one, because he is so high value himself, he will demand a high value partner in turn. However, if that same man can obtain a free mating opportunity, that is, no additional investment is required, they can mate and they can leave, that 10 of a man might now be willing to accept sex with a 5 or above as a partner. So much the way you might prefer the taste and quality of an expensive steak dinner relative to a low-quality fast food. If the fast food is easily obtainable and free, whereas the steak is harder to obtain and costly, the balance between what you prefer and what's available and what you have to put in to get to it probably tips, and it can affect which opportunity you choose to pursue. So accordingly, it should come as little surprise that of the 67 characteristics nominated as desirable in a casual sex partner in David Buss's research that we were covering this time, of those 67 desirable characteristics, men relax their standards for 41 of them in a short-term context. That is, men simply care less about how honest or intelligent or kind or responsible or funny or a great number of things a woman is if she is just offering him short-term sexual access. Women need fewer positive traits to be considered desirable enough for a short-term encounter relative to a long-term one. And these standards are also reduced for negative or undesirable traits as well. These include things like drinking problems, violent partners, emotional issues, anything like that. Men will relax their standards for the negative traits as well. Indeed, in short-term contexts, there are only a very small number of negative traits in a partner that men rate more negatively than women. Specifically, the things that men rated the least desirable in a short-term partner are low sex drive, need for commitment, physical unattractiveness, and excessive hairiness. Those are the 4 traits that men were rating more negatively than women in a short-term context. And when it comes to short-term mating, then, the features that men are rating as unappealing are requiring commitment, which is defeating the purpose of a casual encounter in the first place, because you have to increase your cost, you have to invest more. Having less of an interest in sex, which again defeats the purpose of a casual encounter because it's reducing the opportunities you have to mate. And cues related to their fertility status, which also defeats the adaptive purpose of a mating encounter. If your partner is unattractive or excessively hairy, perhaps these are indicators as to fertility status, which is going to make the risks of engaging in the behavior relatively more pronounced because the benefits would be lower. But beyond these, otherwise, men really are willing to let a lot of things slide for a short-term partner compared to women. And this is because the benefits for men are so great for these short-term encounters, things simply don't need to be perfect. And relatedly, we see some psychological adaptations that appear to generate perceptual shifts in men as well, post-short-term encounter, at least anecdotally. I don't have any hard data on this point, but a frequently reported phenomenon by men is that after they achieve an orgasm with a woman in a short-term encounter, they often experience a steep decline in their perceptions of her as attractive or their interest in spending further time with her. This has a variety of colloquial names, perhaps the most common of which is post-nut clarity, which is implying that men likely make bad or at least suboptimal choices when the prospect of sexual access is on the table. Put in more concrete terms, some psychological adaptations in men, some mental adaptations, would take the prospect of obtaining sexual intercourse as an input, and it would produce outputs downregulating or changing other decision-making mechanisms in your brain, effectively reducing their activation. And indeed, this is what it means to lower your standards. That when you have this attractive sexual opportunity in front of you, or rather this accessible sexual opportunity in front of you, one part of your brain appears to be saying to other parts of your brain, okay, it's not as important that this person is attractive, we can overlook that. It's not as important that this person has an emotional problem, we can overlook that. It downregulates these other mechanisms that attend to these other details to gain that sexual access. But once the deed is done, the mechanism that's downregulating all these others would become less active. You already achieved the sexual access, so that's no longer an input, and these other adaptations in your brain start clicking back on and direct your behavior in other matters. It starts pushing you towards different goals, having obtained the sexual access one. And on this point, it's not really uncommon to hear some advice directed towards men that before you make a big decision, you should consider masturbating. And the idea here, at least behind the suggestion, again, I have no evidence on whether this works, but the idea seems to be to try and help ensure that your decision-making processes for the long term aren't being interfered with by short-term sexual mechanisms instead. That some things are simply going to seem better or worse depending on whether you're horny in the moment. So such perceptual shifts, should they be found more formally and not really anecdotally, would likely represent your underlying psychological mechanisms that are governing these motivational trade-offs between different courses of action. Because every action you take comes with costs, opportunity costs specifically. If I do thing A, I'm not doing thing B, C, D, etc. So as such, men can't be pursuing short-term mating all the time, because if you're doing that, you're not attending to other important tasks in life. Not doing things like eating, obtaining social status, grooming, taking care of children, taking care of your family or friends, any number of other important tasks. And so we should expect that these mechanisms that are dealing with motivations for short-term mating behaviors would function in very context-specific ways, such that men would shift their focus towards other tasks or other interests once the sexual encounter has been obtained, especially if that sexual encounter was obtained with a less than desirable mate. Because you don't want to spend a lot of time investing in a less than desirable prospect if you have better options. So we should expect that this same general adaptive logic is going to hold across a great number of psychological mechanisms governing behavior and motivation. This isn't unique to sex. For instance, if people are hungry, there are going to be some cognitive mechanisms in your brain that make opportunities for food become more appealing. Your goal-directed behavior is going to be focused on food at the expense of other things, relative to when you've just eaten to the point that you're full. And when you're hungry, you're willing to accept a lower quality of food rather than starve. And so we should expect all our motivations here to be shifting on the basis of how well we're currently solving a variety of adaptive problems. So, when the short-term mating problem has been solved, so to speak, at least for the moment, once you've obtained that mating opportunity, you should expect the male brain to begin to shift towards solving other problems that have become relatively more pressing. Now, using this example, however, we can also see one of the benefits that females can reap from short-term encounters as well. And this is that to the extent a woman is willing to forego long-term investment, that is, she's not requiring resources or protection or provisioning from her partner, if she's willing to give that up, she can attract the sexual attention of a more desirable partner for a short-term affair than she might otherwise be able to access in a long-term context. Put in another way, if a woman is willing to only receive genes from her partner, she can access a higher quality of genes through short-term encounters. The more investment she's willing to give up, the higher the quality of a partner she can attract. And as we just reviewed previously, our hypothetical 10 male might accept a female who's a 9 or a 10 for a long-term partner, but might not accept a 5 as a long-term partner. But for a short-term encounter only, if a woman happens to be a 5, she could now access that 10. She can get a higher desirability of partner than she could otherwise. Whereas if that 5 was demanding investment from her partner, maybe she could only get to a 6 in a long-term encounter. Obviously simplified, but it should make the point kind of clear. But because these short-term encounters do come with costs for women, which we just saw, like giving up investment in a partner, if a woman is only getting genes from her partner, she better be sure she's getting the best genes that she can. And as such, it should really come as no surprise that when it comes to short-term mating, women's standards do the opposite thing that men's do. Men relax their standards, women increase theirs when it comes to a short-term encounter. And we saw this in the Clark and Hatfield paper we reviewed in the last lecture, where someone comes up that's working for the experiment and said, hey, I've noticed you're on campus, I think you're really attractive, would you like to, A, go on a date with me, or B, have sex with me? 50% of women were willing to accept the date, 0% of women were willing to accept the short-term encounter. This is the raising of the standards for the short-term encounter because of all the costs that women are going to engage in. Now, there are other ways you could do this research. You can conduct it instead as a thought experiment, as a hypothetical. And this is what a 2011 paper by a researcher called Connolly did. And what you do is you can actually find in this case that men and women are just as interested in casual sex. Now, how did she find this research? That is, specifically, when a short-term mating offer is coming from a uniquely attractive place, women appear just as likely to accept them as men. So if you ask someone in this paper, would you accept a short-term sexual encounter from an extremely attractive and rich celebrity? like, say, a Justin Bieber. Would you be willing to accept that? A lot of women would say yes. And similarly, if you ask men, would you accept a short-term encounter from a really attractive, famous, wealthy actress like an Angelina Jolie or something, or whoever, fill in the actress of your choice, you would also find that men are extremely interested in these short-term encounters. So, in other words, both men and women do consider short-term encounters when their partner is a 10 out of a 10. You don't see much of a sex difference there. Specifically, if women perceive the sex offer to be coming from high social status people, very physically attractive people, familiar people, someone they know personally or someone they specifically like, women are interested in this type of thing. But it's worth pointing out, of course, that most men aren't actually very attractive or famous or familiar or perceived to be skilled in bed. Most women judge men as lacking in these domains, given the 0% acceptance rate in the Clark and Hatfield paper in reality, when we're moving this from an intuition to reality. So what we're seeing here is that women are interested in casual sex at times, but they are predominantly interested in casual sex from more specific, higher quality sources than men. So again, to put this into our numbers example, just to simplify this, if a woman is a 7, she might consider a long-term relationship with a man that's somewhere between a 6 or a 10, depending on how much investment and positive qualities and stuff she can get from him through that relationship. But if that woman is only having casual sex, that 7 now might demand a 9 or a 10 only, and they wouldn't accept it from an 8, 7, or below. This is the reverse of the pattern we saw for men. So in short-term context, you can really boil this down to a simple thing, which is that generally, men tend to go for quantity and women tend to go for quality. However, there are other benefits that women can reap from short-term encounters, and one of them is very simple, which is an immediate access to resources. Women can trade, metaphorically or literally, short-term sexual access for immediate access to resources. And we see this very clearly in cases like prostitution, where one person directly exchanges money for resources or sexual favors. Could be money, could be drugs, could be social favors, could be a lot of stuff. And prostitution is something predominantly engaged in where men tend to be the buyers and women tend to be the sellers. Not always, but generally. And so as such, one mating strategy a woman might pursue is to enter into a long-term relationship with a single partner who provides and protects a lot. This is long-term mating. Another strategy could be to enter into several short-term relationships, each of which offer her something, but not as much as the one single partner did. So it's possible that women can end up as well off or better off by pursuing several smaller sources of resources than one bigger one. Much like how in the modern world, you might find people that want to work a career where they're paid a reliable salary, whereas other people might take up gig work, where maybe they're working on commission, where maybe they make a lot, or maybe they make a little, or they do a lot of small tasks instead of one big one. Similar to that. Making $10 from one source is equivalent to making $1 from 10 sources, all else being equal. So short-term access to resources is another benefit that women can gain from short-term sexual behavior. And a further benefit that both men and women might reap from short-term encounters is to use them to feel out or establish the potential for new long-term relationships. You can think of this as the metaphorical foot in the door, where short-term encounters are used to open up new opportunities or maintain existing opportunities, even if they have a relationship, because this relationship might need to be exited at some point. Because after all, relationships are not these static things. Sometimes a partner can die. Sometimes a partner can abandon you. They can begin to invest less in the relationship than they used to. That when they take it for granted and they stop taking care of themselves and they stop taking care of their partner. Or someone can just fall in value over time. It could be that partner that you picked up that seemed to show a lot of promise for the future several years ago failed to live up to that promise, and the relationship isn't panning out the way you thought it might. So having potential backup mates available to offset the costs of exiting an existing relationship is a valuable strategy to pursue for some people. And it does seem that women may regularly use these short-term affairs as a method of switching partners. Again, as David Buss reports, it turns out that when women in relationships, they have a long-term relationship, when they have an affair, that is, they're cheating, women tend to experience strong romantic feelings for their affair partners with some regularity, including things like falling in love with them. Experiencing these strong emotions for affair partners does seem to be more of the norm in women. In one study, it was found to occur up to about 80% of the time. When a woman was in a relationship and cheating, she tended to experience these very strong romantic attachments to the partner she was cheating with about 80% of the time. And this is really important to note because there are two explanations for why women might be cheating here. Maybe they're trying to secure investment from the long-term partner and get genes from a higher quality partner, a dual mating strategy. Or they might be looking to switch partners. And if you want to distinguish between these two, if a woman is just trying to secure good genes from the partner she's cheating with, that is, if she's trying to effectively cuckold her existing partner, falling in love with her affair partner would be pretty poor adaptive design, because you want to get the genes and then get out. Because these romantic desires don't really appear to fit the functional explanation of simply securing good genes, it seems that predominantly the strategy that might be pursued in affairs, in cheating as far as women is concerned, ultimately tends to be more focused on switching relationships or keeping the opportunity for a new relationship open. And further, supporting this idea is that one of the primary motivators women report for why they sought out an affair in a relationship is their current dissatisfaction with it. Specifically, the less satisfied women were with their current partner, the more likely they were to seek out an affair. And in that respect, it's possible women are sometimes seeking out these short-term affairs while in an existing relationship to try and either establish a backup relationship in the event their primary one fails, or that they're going to exit their primary relationship for a new one altogether. They might break it off, or their partner might break it off, and now they have a backup. Now, of course, that might seem like a little bit of a dumb moment to a lot of people. Like, obviously, those who are unhappy in relationships are more likely to cheat, right? Thing is, that doesn't seem to be the case for men. That is, when it comes to men, the men that cheat in relationships tend to report being about as happy in their relationship as the men who don't cheat. There was one interesting paper by Selterman and colleagues, it was 2023, new paper, which was examining predominantly male Ashley Madison users. Ashley Madison is a site where people go to have affairs. Their sample was made up of predominantly men. They couldn't break this down by gender, but it was almost all men. And what they found is that current relationship satisfaction was among the least related characteristics in people's propensity to cheat, in their propensity to seek out an affair. Men who were perfectly satisfied with their partner were seeking out additional affairs. Indeed, the primary thing men tended to be reporting why they were seeking these affairs was sex. No real surprise there either. So effectively, when it comes to men having affairs, the number of potential new partners is the primary motivator. Sexual variety, sexual access to more partners, owing to how sexual variety affects male reproductive success. Whereas for women, the primary motivator appeared to be things like love and emotional attachments and relationship dissatisfaction. Men seemed to be wanting more partners in general. Women seemed to be wanting better partners. Now, if you're keen about paying attention to those two findings, when it comes to who's having affairs and why, you should really note a discrepancy here which is that women are engaging in affairs to probably secure new long-term partners more often than men, and men are using affairs to secure short-term partners more often than women. And not only does this highlight a sexual difference in sexual psychology in terms of men and women, but it also is fertile ground for romantic and sexual conflict. Women and men are regularly going to be entering into these affairs with different goals in mind, both proximately and ultimately, and this is really a recipe for leaving people disappointed, aggressive, sad, and worse. So while there's a lot more to say about this sexual conflict that can arise between men and women with respect to mating, I want to cut our discussion of short-term mating here for the sake of time, because there's one more topic we should really address, and this is going to be a lengthy one. And specifically, no discussion of sexual preferences would be complete without addressing the topic of homosexuality, which I would refer to for the purposes of this discussion as an exclusive or very nearly exclusive sexual attraction to members of your same sex. So we're talking about exclusive lifetime male-male attraction or exclusive lifetime female-female attraction. Exclusive or very nearly exclusive. While there are people that follow more of a bisexual pattern of attraction, being attracted to both men and women, this discussion is going to focus largely on homosexuality for the sake of simplicity and practicality. So there's a lot to say about this topic for two reasons. The first of which is that it's a bit of a social and political minefield to talk about. Tensions run high about the topic, in no small part because of the social consequences, real or perceived, that can result from these discussions. So I want to make it clear at the outset of what we're going to say that personally, I am supportive of whatever one or more adults wants to do sexually, as long as everyone involved is a consenting party. It doesn't much matter to me what it is, or whether I'm interested in doing it myself. As long as you aren't hurting anyone, go out and have your fun. Do whatever you want to do. I'm supportive of that. I also want to make it clear that my goal in discussing and analyzing the hypotheses that surround homosexuality are just that. They are attempts to understand what causes and maintains homosexuality as a preference in human populations. I'm not looking to commit the naturalistic fallacy here and attempt to say that something is good because it's natural or bad because it isn't, as many people are wont to do. That is, for what it's worth, across many domains, not just homosexuality, I'm supportive of people's ability to explore their sexuality with other consenting adults as they see fit, no matter the cause of their preferences or whatever choices they want to make. Similarly, I'm not opposed to people that are like wearing contacts because contact lenses or eyeglasses aren't natural. Just as I'm not in favor of murder, despite murder happening naturally across the world and across many species. Whether something is natural or whether something is adaptive has no bearing on its moral status in these discussions. Whatever people want to do, as long as they're not hurting other people in the process, I'm into it. And these are relevant points to make for a very simple reason, which is that because the topic itself can be so contentious to people socially, interpretations of evidence and theory surrounding this realm can be remarkably affected by people's personal stance on the issue. Those who are supportive or opposed to homosexuality on a moral level tend to interpret evidence and theory quite differently from one another, just as they do for a great number of socially contentious topics. And I'll give you an example of one right now. This is one we talked about before just during our streams, but I wanted to look at some research by, I think it's Kahan, if I'm pronouncing that right, Kahan and colleagues in 2013. And what they did is they brought people into a lab and they gave them a difficult number problem to solve. And this number problem dealt with a neutral topic. In this case, you said, these people have skin rashes. One group of people used a cream for their skin rash. One group of people didn't. In the first group, this many people got better, this many people got worse. In the second group, this many people got better, and this many people got worse. And the participant's job was to say, does the skin cream make the rash better, or does the skin cream make the rash worse? And what you generally find in this experiment is that, unsurprisingly, people who are better with numbers, people who are better at math, are more likely to get the problem right. No surprises there. However, when you take this exact same problem, the numbers don't change, and instead you change the topic to something people do care about. What they did is they said, instead of rashes and skin cream, they were talking about gun legislation and violent crime. So this state enacted gun legislation. Here's what happened. This state didn't enact gun legislation. Here's what happened. Was the gun legislation effective at reducing violent crime? And what you find in this case is people's personal stance on gun legislation all of a sudden starts to really interfere with their ability to get the correct answer. That is, it's especially pronounced among people who are actually very good with numbers. People who are very good at working with these numbers and solving math problems, the more politically attached to one side of this issue they were, the worse they were at getting the answer right if the evidence didn't support their view. It was pretty substantial, too, this drop. I believe they were about 20%, if memory serves, 20% less likely to get the right answer when all you did was change the topic and all the numbers are exactly the same. Of course, when the evidence supported their view, they were just as likely to get it right. It's only when the evidence didn't support the thing they wanted to hear that all of a sudden their reasoning and math abilities appeared to get a lot worse. So when topics have this social relevance, people are frequently less than objective observers and interpreters of evidence. And we're going to explore this more in future lectures when we talk about humans' reasoning abilities and what the function of those are. But for now, I want to make it clear that discussions of the topic of homosexuality and its causes should ideally be free from our feelings about its acceptability. Now, we're unlikely to reach that goal. I understand I'm a human, you're human. It's probably going to interfere with our interpretation, but we should at least try. Because indeed, the topic of homosexuality is very much one worthy of discussion, as the existence of homosexual preferences appears to cut very harshly against the predictions of evolutionary theory, and it represents a very real paradox that we should untangle. And this is clearly the case because male-male and female-female pairings do not produce offspring. If an individual is inclined to only pursue those same-sex mating arrangements, the reproductive fitness impacts of such a preference would be akin to infertility or sterility. And if we saw that a sizable portion of the population was infertile, we would want to know why. Put simply, psychological homosexual preferences appear massively detrimental to reproductive fitness, which raises questions about their adaptive nature and what mechanisms might generate them. How are they maintained in the population? Now, I want to make it clear, of course, that homosexuality is not proximately harmful. That is, it doesn't negatively impact quality of life or your ability to complete important tasks. It's not like blindness. Blindness really interferes with people's ability to do things and perhaps their satisfaction. This preference doesn't seem to do that at all. But it's still a rather strange thing when the ultimate name of the game is reproduction. That is, we should expect very strong selection against preferences that guide people preferentially towards reproductive dead ends. This is why men tend to have certain age preferences for their partners, and why all people have, well, not all people, but the vast majority of people have certain species preferences for their partners. You don't want to guide your behavior down reproductive dead ends. You don't want to become sexually attracted to trees because you can't mate successfully with trees. You should target that sexual attraction preferentially towards its most viable avenues. So we should expect very strong selection preferences against those that guide people towards these non-reproductive preferences. So why does such a preference exist right now in the population, and how has it been maintained over time? So starting off this discussion, I want to make sure that we're framing the question properly so that we understand what we're talking about and that we're asking the right questions. So when it comes to homosexuality, I want to make it clear at the outset that homosexual behavior itself is not exactly the big adaptive puzzle we're trying to solve. The behavior is certainly part of the question and a topic that requires exploration, but it's not the major paradox here. And you can think about it this way. If we're talking about masturbation and why people do it, there's not so much of an evolutionary puzzle there as to why people enjoy it and why people engage in masturbation. Manual or mechanical, if you're fancy, stimulation of the genitals feels good for the same reason that sexual stimulation of them feels good. The nerves in the genitals can respond to certain proximate physical stimuli, like the pressure or heat, and they can respond to those things in the same way, regardless of whether those inputs are coming from masturbation or sexual behavior. And in that sense, masturbation might be pleasurable and people might enjoy doing it as a byproduct of the adaptive nature of sexual pleasure itself. So while masturbation does not by any means directly contribute to your reproductive success, we might still engage in it because it involves a similar proximate input that mimic ones that are ultimately tied to adaptive behaviors. And on a similar note, of course, homosexual intercourse can provide that same type of sexual stimulation. It's possible people can enjoy same-sex intercourse and experience it as pleasurable for the exact same proximate reasons they do heterosexual intercourse or masturbation. So in much the same way here, people might look at pornography and be aroused by it for the same set of reasons that looking at actual people in front of you engaged in sex might be sexually stimulating, even though the pornography is just lights on a computer screen. As long as the immediate inputs you're receiving are similar, then you're going to generate similar outputs. So, in order of magnitude of paradoxes, of things to explain, the real mystery we're aiming to understand the following. First, we have the small question. This is the one we just discussed. Why would individuals occasionally engage in same-sex behavior when that doesn't produce offspring? This is like the question about masturbation and why people might do it sometimes. So put this in an example here. If you have an adolescent and when they're growing up, they engage in homosexual acts with a childhood friend, but then go on later in life to pursue heterosexual mating, this isn't really mysterious. This was a brief behavior. It didn't really further their reproductive fitness, but it didn't really hinder it either. And not every behavior we engage in is expected to be adaptive. The mechanisms might be adaptive on average, but not every instance of behavior is going to be adaptive. So occasionally doing something that doesn't appear to further a reproductive goal, that's completely expected. The second, larger question is why would people develop a sexual attraction to same-sex members of their species even though it would encourage them to spend time and energy and pursue behaviors and partners that won't assist in contributing to reproduction? Notice that the focus here is now shifted to one of preferences instead of behaviors. So if the same-sex behavior doesn't lead to reproduction, why is there a preference to pursue it frequently? We can again consider masturbation here, because the behavior of masturbation, the behavior, seldom involves the preference of being sexually aroused by oneself, one's body, barring some very unusual circumstances. And people generally tend to prefer to engage in sexual intercourse rather than masturbate. That is, masturbation would prove substantially more mysterious if it involved a psychological sexual attraction to your own body. That attraction would be a very curious thing compared to just the behavior. Instead, when people masturbate, they often engage in this behavior together with or because of other proximate inputs that mimic adaptive contexts, like pornography or sexual fantasies about having sex with desirable other people. This is why people tend to become aroused and then engage in masturbation, these things that mimic adaptive behaviors. People aren't masturbating because they're attracted to their own body, but because they're receiving inputs about attractive other people. And so we can put this into another example as well. If you have a reproductive aged adult and they decide to pursue whatever sexual opportunities arise for them, they're attracted to literally everybody. Doesn't matter how physically attractive their partner is to other people. Doesn't matter if their prospective partners are male or female, whether they're young or old. They're just attracted to literally everybody. This preference is somewhat more mysterious than the behavior, because this lack of selectivity can result in a great deal of time and energy spent on non-adaptive pursuits. The mechanism that's guiding behavior is going to generate a lot of potentially maladaptive behaviors. And so psychological mechanisms that produce these non-selective attractions and encourage maladaptive choices would be more curious things requiring explanation relative to just spending one day masturbating or engaging in homosexual behavior once. The attraction is more curious. However, in this case, this hypothetical person who's attracted to literally everybody, this person isn't foregoing making any adaptive choices altogether. That is, some of their partners will be reproductively viable and some of them won't. But there will still be partners in there that are reproductively viable. So this attraction to everybody preference would be strange, but it wouldn't be entirely maladaptive. It would just be suboptimal. It would be perhaps not the best way, not the most discerning way of making decisions, but it could sometimes produce adaptive outcomes. The third question, and this is the biggest paradox in this realm, is why would individuals develop a sexual disinterest or a heterosexual aversion? That is the real paradox of the preference. That is, if you ask many heterosexual people to think about, imagine having sex with a member of your same sex, a lot of them would report feeling revulsion or disgust, or they wouldn't be aroused by it. And in much the same way, if you ask homosexual people to imagine having sex with partners of the opposite sex, they will report a very similar set of things. So this last question here is particularly important, this prospect of the sexual disinterest in the opposite sex, because the homosexual preference typically involves both of these. It's an attraction towards people of your same sex and an aversion to intercourse with people of the opposite sex. And the aversion is the more pressing topic. That's the thing that really requires explanation. And the reason why is simple. That aversion is the part that is actively foregoing the ability to make adaptive mating decisions. The ones that are likely to produce offspring, the ones that are capable of producing offspring. Occasionally, or even regularly, pursuing members of the same sex as mating partners, that's less harmful to reproductive fitness than avoiding all mating with the opposite sex. So again, adding in a final example here, if someone developed a sexual attraction to their own body, that would be weird. That would be unusual. That's not typical. But if they also developed a sexual disgust towards all other people, they were only aroused by their own body, this disgust would be the more curious part of it, because this seems to resemble an active flight from reproductive success rather than the pursuit of a non-optimal strategy. This isn't sometimes doing something adaptive. This is purposefully avoiding doing anything that might be adaptive. And these are really important points to bear in mind because a lot of the research on homosexual behavior, especially in non-human species, is often just that. It's research on behavior. That is, there are plenty of documented cases of homosexual behavior in non-human species. But what's far less common, indeed almost unheard of, is to find documented cases of common homosexual orientations in other species, where, say, males are going to become aroused by and attempt to mate almost exclusively with other males while avoiding mating with females throughout their life. Only one such case I'm aware of exists in the non-human literature. Humans are one species where this happens. The other species I'm aware of where this has been well documented is in domestic sheep. There's about 10% of rams will exclusively become aroused by and attempt to mate with other males while avoiding other females throughout the entire lifespan. And this is really an important point to make here. This is a very important distinction because if you're talking about, let's say, chimps, and you have two females that are foraging for food, and during this foraging, one female touches another female briefly on the genitals, this would be counted as homosexual behavior. But explaining why that happens is a much different thing than explaining why a female might not only seek out that attention from other women, but exclusively avoid it from all other males. If you see occasional homosexual behavior and also heterosexual behavior, this is much less of a pressing mystery to explain than when you see only homosexual behavior and no heterosexual behavior, heterosexual aversion. That's the part that's really mysterious. So, because homosexual attraction and heterosexual aversion, when you combine these two, appear to encourage behaviors that don't reproduce themselves, this yields a partial, though somewhat odd answer to the question of how are homosexual preferences maintained in the population. And that is, individuals that develop homosexual preferences, these preferences exist because of heterosexual behavior and the usually heterosexual preferences of their parents. That's the only method to reproduce. So to the extent that these preferences are the homosexual preferences are being reproduced, they are being reproduced by heterosexual preferences and behaviors. So one of the things maintaining homosexuality in the population must almost paradoxically be heterosexuality, because that is the only route to reproduction. That is, if you imagine a population made up 50% of exclusively heterosexual maters and exclusively homosexual maters, they will only ever engage in sexual behavior with either the opposite sex or the same sex throughout their entire lifespan. In the next generation, only one of those groups is going to have reproduced. And that's the one that's pursuing heterosexual intercourse. So whatever genes are contributing to the development of the homosexual preferences and exclusive behaviors should be bred out of the population in effectively a single generation. And we saw this previously when we were discussing how evolution isn't about survival of the fittest. It's got nothing to do with physical fitness, it's got nothing to do with survival, and it certainly has nothing to do with happiness and pleasure. It only has to do with reproduction. That's the process that shapes all the biological mechanisms in life. So as this outcome, where homosexual preferences clearly have not been selected out of the population, in that there are still a substantial minority of people that report this currently, and we have documented examples of it throughout history, and we also have examples of it in domestic sheep. This selection out hasn't happened yet. There's clearly something else that is creating and maintaining this preference in the population, beyond direct reproduction, because this preference has very severe reproductive costs. Even if, say, you're not talking about exclusive heterosexuality and exclusive homosexuality, even if you're talking about someone that engages on a percentage basis, 100% heterosexual and 0% homosexual, or 50-50 or 60-40, whatever you want to come up with, the math is always going to work out the same. It's like trying to invest in lottery tickets. If you have $1 million and you buy 1 million lottery tickets, you're going to usually make less than $1 million back from that. And then if you take whatever you make back and you continuously invest in lottery tickets, eventually the math says you're going to run out of money. There are severe reproductive costs in much the same way to these preferences. And so something must be maintaining them in the population. Something must be generating them and maintaining them in the population. And one last note, before we're going to be jumping into this topic more fully next time, which is that it's possible male and female homosexuality shows somewhat of a different developmental course. As to why, it's hard to say, but there are some lines of evidence that suggest these might follow different developmental courses. According to some research by Martos and colleagues from a 2015 paper, for instance, males tend to report an earlier age at which they feel like they were clear about their sexual preferences than women. And as a result of that, as well as the way sexual behavior and arousal can function more generally, where men who don't become physically aroused typically have difficulty achieving intercourse relative to women, it's also more likely that you see homosexual men report fewer, if any, opposite sex partners in their life relative to homosexual women. There was some data on this point presented by Elza Brown and Paula England on contexts.org. This was some 2016 numbers they pulled bearing on this point. That is, among the people who identified as heterosexual, 2% of men and 10% of women reported ever having a sexual partner of their same sex. So among people that say, I'm heterosexual, 2% of men said, I've also had a sexual encounter with a man, and 10% of women said, I have had sexual encounter with a woman. Among homosexual respondents, those percentages were 39% for men that ever had an opposite sex partner, and 50% for women that ever had an opposite sex partner. Which could have something to do with the way arousal works and the age at which someone got a sense for what their sexuality was. And there's also the matter of bisexuality and how this differs between the sexes. And you can see some data on that here. This data is from a 2013 paper by Savin Williams. And I'm not going to pronounce this right, but Vranglova, I believe their name is. And this was also in accordance with some additional 2011 data from Gary Gates, reported from the Williams Institute, which is that the vast majority of both men and women report being heterosexual. As you can see here, the graph is a little truncated, but about 95 to 97% of men and women report being heterosexual. In the case of men, you have a higher percentage that report being heterosexual, and a higher percentage. Well, actually, let me rewind that a little bit. Most men report being heterosexual, about 95 to 97%. About 3% of men report being homosexual in decreasing order, and about 1% of men report being bisexual. So it's about roughly, let's say 96% heterosexual, 3% homosexual, 1% bisexual. For women, you see a slightly different pattern. In women, most are heterosexual, just like men. But the next most common orientation is bisexuality in women. And then the least common orientation is homosexuality. And over time, there might also be some shifts in women towards bisexuality in some instances. There was a book by Lisa Diamond called Sexual Fluidity, which was following a group of teens from young adulthood, from their teens to their young adulthood. These were largely non-heterosexual women, But what she found over time is that they tended to shift their preferences, not much, but a little bit more towards the bisexual end of the spectrum than towards the homosexual end of it. So it's possible that male and female homosexuality follows different developmental courses, and because of that, it's also possible that male and female homosexuality may have slightly different causes. But I'm going to treat the analysis of both of these things as similar for our purposes because both orientations in men and women carry similar reproductive fitness costs and probably represent similar underlying psychological mechanisms. So as we're running short on time for today, and there's still a lot to cover that needs to be discussed thoroughly and with great caution owing to the nature of the subject, we're going to get into a fuller examination of the hypotheses surrounding the causes of and maintenance of homosexuality in the population next time. What causes it and how is it maintained, despite those reproductive costs? Now, I can tell you up front that there has yet to be any definitive answer to this question of causation. We don't know why it arises and why it is stable in the population over time. But there have been no shortage of ideas as to why that might be the case. Part of the reason that there have been no shortage of ideas, however, is because most of the hypotheses that people have put forth on the topic either make no theoretical sense, they haven't been well supported by the evidence, or they've been flat out contradicted by the evidence, or both of those things are true. There are a lot of ideas around the topic, many of which lack strong theoretical and empirical foundations, which is why we don't have a great answer right now. But given how politically charged the topic can be, conducting research on it can be difficult because some questions are perceived to be offensive. And some people also view those same questions as being unable to be asked or examined because of that perceived offensiveness to them, or because of whatever potential implications might arise from those ideas. So what we're aiming for here is merely an examination of what theories do exist and looking at what evidence supports them or doesn't support them and how is it consistent and do they make conceptual sense. And hopefully through this examination we can create more happiness and more productive knowledge for everyone and minimize the amount of negativity and harm that might surround this topic.